Thomas Pynchon fans, rejoice. On October 7th, Thomas Pynchon is probably going to release his last novel as a living author, Shadow Ticket. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the plot and the limited details that we do know. And I'm also going to be discussing a plan for those who have never read Pynchon before, who want to be prepared for this new novel, because something that happens when you hear people like me and others say Thomas Pynchon is the greatest living novelist is that it creates this expectation for you as a reader. And I saw this with Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger. For around a year, there was all this hype about Cormac McCarthy's new novel, and it was reinforced by everyone knowing about The Road and No Country for Old Men and all the Blood Meridian bros saying he's the greatest novelist in the world. And so then when all these new readers of McCarthy got their copy of The Passenger in October or whenever it was and flipped it open, they were met with a 150-page initial meditation on schizophrenia. They were met with digressions into JFK and McCarthy sending them down this plotless rabbit hole with deformed people and trans people and like all this other crazy stuff. And as a McCarthy fan, I was like, oh shit, we're doing this finally, something more modern that isn't a thriller like No Country for Old Men or The Counselor. But I know countless people who didn't make it to the back half of the novel where things actually got really, really good, where McCarthy, I feel like, was writing at maybe his highest level. And so the same could be said about Shadow Ticket. It is going to clock in around 400 pages, which for a Pynchon novel is on the shorter side, even though obviously there have been shorter novels than 400 pages. And so I'd like to now read the description that we were given so that we can compare it to some of the plots of his other novels so we can kind of see where this may land. And then when we are done with that, I will give new Pynchon readers a 5-month reading list and game plan to prepare for this novel. Milwaukee, 1932, the Great Depression going full blast, repeal of prohibition just around the corner, Al Capone in the federal pen, the private investigation business shifting from labor management relations to the more domestic kind. Hicks McTaggart, a one-time strikebreaker turned private eye, thinks he's found job security until he gets sent out on what should be a routine case, locating and bringing back the heiress of a Wisconsin cheese fortune who's taken a mind to go wandering. Before he knows it, he's been shanghaied onto a transoceanic liner, ending up eventually in Hungary, where there's no shoreline, a language from some other planet, and enough pastry to see any cop well into retirement. And of course, no sign of the runaway heiress he's supposed to be chasing. By the time Hicks catches up with her, he will find himself also entangled with the Nazis, Soviet agents, British counterspies, swing musicians, practitioners of the paranormal, outlaw motorcyclists, and the troubles that come with each of them, none of which Hicks is qualified, forget about being paid, to deal with. Surrounded by history he has no grasp on and can't see his way around in or out of, the only bright side for Hicks is that it's the dawn of the big band era, and it happens he's a pretty good dancer. Whether this will be enough to allow him somehow to Lindy hop his way again back to Milwaukee and the normal world, which may no longer exist, is another question. And my God, everyone, that is a book description. That is a hooker right there. Someone who is very talented wrote that, at least in my opinion. This is what I always say to self-published authors, like, you need to have a pitch like that. That is a pitch to read this. You're walking into the Shark Tank when you try to get your book out to the world, and this is all you got. So what is this novel going to compare to in Pynchon's catalog? Because on the surface level, it seems like Slothrop goes noir, Gravity's Rainbow meets Inherent Vice. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the author Dashiell Hammett and his novel, The Maltese Falcon. But he was a major author writing about the Prohibition era and also covering similar themes to what Pynchon is trying to do. And if you guys remember in Inherent Vice, Pynchon, I don't want to say steals, but gathers energy from Raymond Chandler and The Big Sleep. And so Pynchon, who is obviously very well read, takes some of these classic approaches, the detective wandering into something way over his head, into this corruption, and just takes it to the extreme. So I can assume that this will start in like the recognizable noir mode where we're just in this world and there's this problem, and then it's going to slowly just descend into, a couple detours, and suddenly we're in Hungary, and then there's conspiracies and metaphysics, and the resolution is just going to slowly fade away. And because Hicks goes international, that's going to make it even more so. And something brilliant that Pynchon does in a lot of his novels is find these tipping points, finds these, we're in the big band era where the Great Depression is at like its peak. There's fascism starting in Europe and the Prohibition era is ending. Like, this is a big moment. In Gravity's Rainbow, we're in the zone. Mostly after World War II, many of the best authors behind me find these points in history if they're writing about something in the past, and write about that, because much of our reality is based on what happened, and sometimes not in decades, but just in these couple years during one of these tipping points. So brilliant stuff there. This novel could also be close to Pynchon's V because of kind of the ping-ponging across continents, that Herbert Stencil does in V. And last but not least, as I was saying, I think that this is going to have some similar themes to Gravity's Rainbow. There is going to for sure be a critique of the elite. We have a cheese heiress. Why is she wandering? But Pynchon, probably because of his old age, doesn't have the time to go on as many digressions, we'll see, as in something like Gravity's Rainbow. And so we kind of get this preview of Nazis, Soviets, the paranormal, outlaw motorcyclists, swing musicians. Almost all of those outside of the motorcyclists were present in Gravity's Rainbow already. But a lot of the time we were like given these very indirect scenes where Slothrop's on a ship or at the casino, and it's filled with this group of people, but we never really get too much exploration with those people. And then when we do in other chapters that usually don't involve Slothrop, there's always some hidden double meaning or ulterior motive baked into some of these characters. And with the length of the novel, you can kind of do that. But clocking in, like I said, at 400 pages, I think a lot of that should be cut. And judging on some of Pynchon's previous novels, probably the last 2 or 3, we may have some more direct discourse, which I'm honestly super excited about, because it's always nice to get a shred of clarity from Pynchon about his perception of reality. So now I want to discuss what books you should read before you tackle Shadow Ticket. And so I think that so we have 5 months. I think that it wouldn't be a terrible idea if you wanted to, if you feel like a very, very strong reader and you want to commit to the finish, to just pick up Gravity's Rainbow and get that done. That's terrible advice, but at some level, if you read Gravity's Rainbow, you will for sure be ready for Shadow Ticket. And as I was saying earlier, you will get kind of a preview and more of an in-depth, meandering analysis of 10 years in the future with World War II than the 1930s that Shadow Ticket is going to cover. And so if you are not willing to do that and want a more slow buildup, this is the list. And just an FYI, I run the Right Conscious Book Club, which is, yes, the most active and most hardcore book club in the world. We read 8 to 10 novels a month. I release, or I should say I will be releasing course videos that will be an hour long before each book club call, breaking down the book. And yes, we meet on Saturdays in the morning Pacific time. And so we are reading one Pynchon novel a month until we are done. Some may be 2 months. Gravity's Rainbow, Against the Day, and Mason and Dixon will spread across 2 months each. So this is the order we are going to be reading his novels in preparation for Shadow Ticket, because it's really fun to read a book with a group that's new, that no one has read before. Because, in some of our book clubs, there are people who have read the books before. And so which makes it fun. But when you read something new, it always has a certain energy. And so our first book that we are going to be reading in May is the classic, The Crying of Lot 49, which is Pynchon's shortest novel, but it has a pretty hard punch. It really kind of throws you headfirst into Pynchon's writing style and his world. I've read this multiple times, and I get something more every single time. If you go look on the Pynchon on websites that talk about Pynchon, whether Reddit or older kind of forum type websites, there is endless discussion about this book, even though it isn't very long. And so this is always a good warm-up novel to get into Pynchon, because he actually has easier novels like Inherent Vice in terms of just reading it. But because this one is short and because it's harder, it gets people into the style, but then it also guarantees that a decent amount of people finish it. So after that, we have The Bleeding Edge by Pynchon, which is his most recent novel, and it came out in 2013. This one is a noir novel, but it is different than Inherent Vice and will be different than Shadow Ticket because it's mostly taking place in the modern world, dealing with the internet and digital conspiracies. But the reason I wanted to put this one here is that it's good to read the most recent novel of an author before the next one, because it will most likely be in a very similar writing style, especially if he's been working on these like somewhat in a row, and that Shadow Ticket wasn't something he wrote in the 1970s and put it in a box and just made some revisions this year. We don't exactly know. But if he's been writing these somewhat in order, then his prose style will probably be more like Bleeding Edge than it will be like V or something like that. And speaking of V, that is what we are going to be reading in the month of July. This is going to be our first big push into one of Pynchon's, one could say, harder novels, a novel that is a little bit more meandering. I don't know if Shadow Ticket is going to go that way, but as I was saying earlier, V has some similar themes from what I can tell. It's not as long as Gravity's Rainbow, and it's a really good introduction to Gravity's Rainbow and some of the other works. And so because we'll be reading Gravity's Rainbow after October, probably near the end of the year, this is a good one to get out of the way. After that, we will be reading Inherent Vice, which, as I was saying, probably is going to have a lot of similarities to Shadow Ticket. It is an easier novel, a more laid-back novel. One could say this is the easiest Pynchon novel to read. I personally like this novel. I know some people kind of have a problem with it, but this one is always a fun read, and that is what we will be reading in August. And then in September, we are going to be reading Vineland, and this is really only out of necessity because we don't have time to read one of the longer works. And so this is probably one of the least talked about novels by Pynchon, but this is what we are going to be reading. And I think by then we are going to be ready and prepped for Shadow Ticket. And then once we're through Shadow Ticket, I feel like the energy in the group and with you, if you're just doing this on your own, is going to be really good. And then you'll be able to tackle the longer novels. And so I don't care if you join the group. I would love to have you in the group. A group holds you accountable and make sure that you get it done. And it's fun to talk to people about the novel. We have some really cool people in the group. But this is my game plan for you to be ready, even if you aren't going to join the group. And so you can always comment later on, because there's going to be a ton of Pynchon novels, because I'm going to be reading him and he's going to be in my head, and tell me about your progress and what you think about him and all of that. And so I would like to thank each and every one of you guys for being here, and I will see you guys very soon in the next video on Pynchon, which will be dropping very soon.